Product Managers, MRD, PRD, BRD requirements. As a rule, ideas are accumulated into a Marketing Requirements Document, or MRD. The gist of the MRD is it would be good to have these functionalities on our website. Then, ideas from the MRD are approved, disapproved, or ignored by the management, and those ideas that were approved are passed on to the product managers, or PMs in short, who create specs based on those ideas. Brain positioning. As a rule, a manager is a person who manages other people. Product managers don't manage people, instead they manage products. The product is another word for software or its part. For example, at Facebook, there are product managers who are specialized in the product called security and privacy. This stage of SDLC is called product design, because here we design how the software should work and or look. You can also say that we design product features. Those features are documented in specs. Specs can also be called the PRD, or Product Requirements Document, the BRD, Business Requirements Document, or simply the requirements. We need specs to design the product. The difference between the idea and the design is this. The idea is a description of the purpose. For example, we want to enable people to do this and that. The design is a description of the way to reach the purpose. For example, in order to enable people to do this and that, we have to do the following. The most effective PMs are those who have A. Professional and or educational backgrounds in the area they specialize in. For example, if someone is designing banking software, previous banking experience is very helpful. B. A little bit of technical knowledge. For example, understanding the difference between web server, application core, and database. We'll learn about this soon. Part A is simply needed to make sure that the PM knows what he is talking about. You wouldn't be happy about working on banking software with a PM who doesn't understand the difference between debit and credit cards. Also, a PM should be an educator, because the spec should reflect the product design in a way that let developers and testers completely understand what they are required to develop and test. Part B enables PMs to speak the same language as developers. I'm not talking about English, Hindi, or Russian. It's about the common technical language that's an essential part of communication inside a software company. For example, it's expected that the PM who writes specs for banking software knows what abbreviation SSL stands for, Secure Sockets Layer. Essential spec attributes. Each spec should have a title, preferably unique, for example, Functional Improvements for the Search. A unique ID, for example, number 8765. Specs should be divided into indexed sections and subsections for ease of understanding and reference. Each spec should have a priority. Usually this is a number from 1 to 4 inclusive. The P1 spec is the most important. Here is why we need spec priorities. We can have a situation where we don't have time to implement all specs we plan for a particular release. In that case, specs with lower priorities, for example, P2 is lower than P1, can be dropped from the release and rescheduled for one of the future releases. The developer and tester should always start their programming and testing with functionalities from the spec with a higher priority. The functionalities from the spec with a higher priority should be tested more thoroughly than those with a lower priority. We all know that it's impossible to fully test a more or less complex system, but we surely can and must provide special treatment for those specs with higher priorities. That doesn't mean that P4 specs will be tested as though they mean nothing to the company. It simply means that we have to give more attention and care to the testing of a P1 spec than we give to a P4 spec. The spec priority is assigned to each spec by the PM manager or by the PM himself or herself. 7 rules for writing solid specs. Good specs, like good laws, have the following 7 characteristics or rules. Rule number 1, clarity of detail and definitions. Rule 2, no room for misinterpretation. Rule 3, absence of internal or external conflicts. Rule 4, solid, logical structure. Rule 5, completeness. Rule 6, compliance with laws. Rule 7, compliance with business practices. Problems in specs show up if the PM has broken one or more of these 7 rules. Breaking rule number 1, clarity of details and definitions. Example: here is an extraction from Spec 1111, New User Registration. 1.5. During new user registration, the system should check that the email address entered by the user has good characters and has a global domain name at the end of the address right after the dot. Does this sound clear to you? What characters are good? What is the global domain name? What happens if bad characters are entered? The PM must do 3 things to clarify what is meant by a valid email address. 1. Specify that the email address contains only one @ character. 2. Provide a reference to or a complete list of illegal characters for email addresses, in other words, characters that cannot be included in an email address, for example, comma. 3. Provide rules about the format of an email. For example, there should be at least one alphanumeric, A through Z, 0 through 9 character before the @ character, a@sharelane.com. Next, global domain names is not a conventional term. The correct term is top-level domain. The PM should use the correct term and provide rules about top-level domain formatting. By the way, a top-level or first-level domain has either a generic name with 3 or more characters, for example, com or info, or a 2-character territory code based on the standard ISO 3166, for example, RU for Russia. Consequences. The standard practice of a new user registration consists of 3 stages. 1. The user submits the web registration form. 2. The website sends the user an email with a confirmation link. 3. The user clicks the confirmation link and his registration is complete. So, if the system doesn't check email addresses for 2 or more @ characters, then if the user erroneously submits a registration form with such an email address, for example, Anna_Fuente @sharelane.com, no error message will be displayed and the user will never receive the email with the confirmation link. The user would wait for a while for an email from your site, and then, being tired of waiting, he or she would just type in the URL of your competitor into their browser's address bar. By the way, URL or Uniform Resource Locator is a unique address of the resource, usually a file on the network, for example, on your local company's network intranet, or on Network of Networks Internet. If a URL describes location of the file, you can provide the file name directly. For example, www.sharelane.com test portal HTML. Or, in certain cases, the web server would send you the default file. For example, if you type www.sharelane.com index.html or www.sharelane.com, you'll get the same result. Breaking rule number 2, no room for misinterpretation. Example: there is a classic comedy act when 2 people are talking about different things, but don't understand this and keep going on. 2 spouses talking over the phone. You know, honey, I'm so sick and tired of spam. Spam meaning junk mail. Too bad, my dear. I'm afraid that you'll be without dinner tonight. Why? Because we have nothing but spam in our home. Spam meaning canned meat. So, you want me to go hungry? No, but you said that you are sick and tired of spam. To be continued. In the above example, this dialogue happened only because the honey misinterpreted the word spam. The honey is not to blame because the deer should have known that the honey might not understand the intended meaning of spam or junk mail. In our everyday communication, we have this kind of situation very often, and in some cases it ends up in an ugly way, like we're not friends anymore just because someone misinterpreted something, words, gestures, etc. Let's remember poor Romeo, who misinterpreted Juliet's sleep as a death and offed himself. Consequences? If a spec opens the door for misinterpretation, there is the danger that the programmer and/or tester will misunderstand that spec, and thus the code and/or test cases won't reflect what the PM really meant while writing the spec. It sounds simple, won't reflect. But in reality, this can have very serious consequences for the company, especially when big money and important contracts are involved. The most obvious way to avoid misinterpretation of the specific terms used in the spec is to write down both the terms and their clear definitions in the beginning of the spec. Later on, we'll talk about taking other measures to prevent spec misinterpretations. Breaking rule number 3, absence of internal or external conflicts. Example, spec number 1, 8.1.1. For delivery, user can enter any postal address within lower 48 United States. Spec number 2, 7.3. Delivery must be made only to the billing address. Consequences: if the conflict between these two specs is not sorted out, we can have the following situation. One programmer, following Spec 1, writes code to allow users to enter any address for delivery. Another programmer, following Spec 2, writes code to prevent delivery to any address except the billing address. It's where the credit card is registered. What can happen next is that during checkout, a user enters his mother's address to send her a Christmas gift, but the mother will never receive the gift because while the software allowed the user to enter any address, it prevented the worker in the warehouse to send the item because the provided address didn't correspond with the billing address. Breaking rule number 4, solid logical structure. Example, hey diddle diddle, the cat and the fiddle, the cow jumped over the moon. The little dog laughed to see such fun, and the dish ran away with the spoon. Thanks to the unknown author of this nursery rhyme for illustrating how disconnected the components of the same system can be. Consequences. Basically, the solid logical structure of a spec is about the connections between topics, ideas, data, examples, etc. If the items of the spec are mixed and intermingled like spaghetti, this is a sure way to lead spec users, developers, testers, etc. into confusion or worse, into misunderstanding. A confused person usually asks questions while a person who misunderstood something might not be aware of it. Like Mark Twain said, it ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble, it's what you know for sure that just ain't so. The golden rule for PM should be write your spec like a tutorial using clear, simple language and an easy-to-follow structure. Breaking rule number 5, completeness. Example, in trying to fight credit card fraud, credit card companies introduced a new safety measure called CVV2, Card Verification Value 2. CVV2 is 3, all cards except Amex or 4 Amex only digits, following the card number on the back of the credit card. If for whatever reason the PM failed to include the CVV2 verification code into the spec, the company could get exposed to fraudsters who usually have all the credit card information except the CVV2 numbers. Consequences: many internet companies, including several online payment systems, ran out of money and died because of internet fraud. In our age, issues about security cannot be taken lightly, and the failure to acknowledge the importance of fraud prevention will backfire pretty quickly and severely. Even if your company can deal with the enormous losses caused by internet fraud, the company's customer support and financial and legal departments will have a lot of trouble trying to sort out the consequences of security-related mistakes. Bottom line, things omitted are often more deadly than errors committed. Leo F. Buscaglia. Breaking rule number 6, compliance with laws. Example, because of an embargo, Cuban cigars cannot be sold in the U.S., so if somebody sets up a website that sells Cuban cigars to customers in the U.S., that person is breaking the law. Consequences? Remember Napster. Breaking rule number 7, compliance with business practices. Example, because of the many variables about a money transfer, banks cannot guarantee the exact date when a money transfer will be complete. That's why it's business practice to inform customers about the approximate number of days in the form of a range, for example, 3 to 6 business days. So if a money transfer usually takes 3 to 6 business days, we should not promise our customers that they will get their money on an exact day. It's much better to just have a nice, simple confirmation message. Money transfers usually take 3 to 6 business days. Consequences. Dr. Rodinoff is sure that on the exact date promised by our company, his account will have 300,000 pounds of sterling. He flies to London to participate in an auction of Russian art of the 19th century to acquire the dream of his life, a beautiful landscape painting by Ivan Ivazovsky. He bids aggressively and wins the painting for 235,000 pounds. Now, it's time to pay. The cashier takes his debit card and after several futile attempts, she says out loud in the only way cashiers can do, "Dr. Rodinoff's card has been declined." First question, will Dr. Rodinoff ever use our service again? No. Second question, will Dr. Rodinoff ever recommend our company to anyone except his enemies? No. Third question, which words and expressions will Dr. Rodinoff use from now on if somebody mentions our company? Let's not elaborate on that. Specs and technical instructions. The last thing I'd like to mention about incorrect specs is this. Some PMs are confident that their specs will provide instructions about purely technical aspects to programmers, like setting up the relationships between tables in the DB or the names of variables to be used in the code. Generally, this is a bad idea because even if the PM has a programming background, he has zero to vague understanding about the reality of coding in that particular company. Lesson recap. Number 1, the product is another word for software or its part. 2, product managers don't manage people, instead they manage products. 3, product design is a process that leads to detailed description of features that we want to implement in our software. 4, other names for spec are the PRD or Product Requirements Document, the BRD, Business Requirements Document, or the Requirements. 5. The spec must have a title, ID, and priority. The spec's priority reflects the importance the company places on the spec's features. The highest priority is 1, the lowest priority is 4. Programmers and testers must always start working with specs that have the highest priority. 6. The PM should follow 7 rules while creating specs. Rule 1. Clarity of details and definitions. Rule 2. No room for misinterpretation. Rule 3. Absence of internal or external conflicts. Rule 4. Solid logical structure. Rule 5. Completeness. Rule 6. Compliance with laws. Rule 7. Compliance with business practices. 7. Specs should not provide instructions about purely technical aspects to programmers.